A quick warning, today's episode contains discussion about a kidnap, rape and murder plot with some upsetting details. From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. On Friday, Gavin Plumb was sentenced.
As well as everything else I know about you, including the facts of your prior convictions for similarly sexually motivated, violent offending against women, I conclude that I must impose on you a sentence of imprisonment for life.
The crime? Soliciting the murder of and inciting the kidnap and rape of Holly Willoughby, the TV presenter. Our reporter has been covering the case and looking at the aftermath.
In this type of case where there was an immediate threat to somebody's life, that was quite unusual. But it's not unusual in terms of the level of misogyny that's been meted out in these types of groups.
So what does this grim trial tell us about a world that some men inhabit? And are there lessons for society? The story today, the Holly Willoughby trial and a toxic online subculture.
I'm David Woode and I'm the crime correspondent for The Times.
For the past few weeks, David, you've been following this case at Chelmsford Crown Court. What was the trial looking at?
It was the case of Gavin Plumb, who was a 37-year-old man who was charged in connection with a kidnap plot against the TV presenter Holly Willoughby.
And we know it's Holly Willoughby because she has waived her right to anonymity, which you would get in this instance.
Exactly.
Do we know why she's done that, incidentally?
When the guy was arrested in October last year, she was named and pictured on the front page of a newspaper. At the time, it was unclear that there was also a third charge of incitement to rape. And under Sexual Offences Amendment Act, anyone who is the victim of a sexual offence or an alleged sexual offence is entitled to lifelong anonymity unless they waive it. So because she had been named in respect for the soliciting murder and incitement to kidnap, when the third charge emerged, it's almost as if the genie had left the bottle.
Yes.
So you couldn't have found a way to report this trial having had this adverse publicity if she already had been identified. So days before the trial opened, we were told that she intended to waive her right to anonymity on the first day of the proceedings.
I see. And can we get into the real basics of this case, first of all? For anyone who's been living under a rock, who is Holly Willoughby?
Holly Willoughby is one of Britain's most well-known and best-loved presenters. She started her career on children's television in the early mid-2000s and then kind of worked her way up through the ranks. So many people will know her as a panellist on Celebrity Juice. In 2009, she joined the presenting lineup at ITV's This Morning.
Hi, good morning and welcome to your Wednesdays This Morning.
We've got lots in store for you today.
She co-hosted with Philip Schofield for 14 years.
This morning, we've taken extra cooling precautions. Look at this.
Yeah, the team have very kindly invested in some deluxe pools.
Until her departure shortly after Gavin Plumb was arrested and charged in connection with these crimes.
Holly Willoughby has tonight quit ITV's This Morning, saying she had to make the decision for herself and her family. It follows the court appearance last week of a man accused of conspiring to kidnap and murder her.
She is also a businesswoman. She's got a lifestyle business, Wild Moon. She's endorsed beauty brands. She has released books with her sister, like children's books, but also millions of followers. I think 8.4 million followers on Instagram.
It's working. I think it's working. I'm live. Now I've just got to do some gubbins. Hi, Holly Wills UK. Hello. Right, hold on. I just need to do something here.
Many people follow her for her fashion and style, but also they take a peek behind the curtain into the world of showbiz.
Someone who we now know was quite obsessed with her is this Gavin Plumb. What do we know about him?
Gavin Plumb was born in February 1987, so he's 37 years old. What we knew about him was that he was a security guard, a father of two. He worked a succession of jobs. He lived in Harlow in Essex. And people who knew him said that when he was at school, he was a bit of a loner. And really, this was a man who essentially had had some issues growing up. He had some weight issues and he put on a lot of weight. At his heaviest, he became about 35.5 stone.
Wow.
He shut himself away, is what he told the court.
His criminality didn't start with this Holly Willoughby case. He's actually got previous convictions going back as far as 2006.
Yeah, and that was introduced to the court on the first day of the trial, which was very unusual. Normally, reporters, we would know this. We wouldn't be able to report it until the end of the trial. But the prosecution successfully applied to include this so the jury were able to understand who this person was and they could contextualise the crimes he was accused of. So in 2006, Gavin Plumb was working as a civil enforcement officer, like checking ticket machines at train stations in Essex, Hertfordshire way. And in August 2006, he attempted to kidnap two female Ryanair stewardesses on the Stansted Express train. We were told that he sat opposite them, unfolded a piece of paper which says, don't say anything. At the next stop, get off. I'm armed, and if you don't do as I say, I'll shoot myself, I'll shoot you, and I'll shoot everyone around us.
What happened after that?
The first woman became very distressed. She refused to get off the train. And 2 days later, Plumb tried it again with another stewardess on the same train, on the same service. And this time he said that he had a gun on him and he pretended to be a police officer. Police were called and he dismissed it as a prank. He was arrested and he was remanded in custody. He spent 8 months on remand, and when it went to court, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of attempted kidnap and was given a suspended sentence and a supervision order. In 2008, he was working as a security guard in Woolworths in Harlow in Essex when he tried to falsely imprison 2 16-year-old shop assistants. They were in the stockroom. Plumb approached them. He tried to tie the hands of one of the young girls behind her back. We were told that there were box cutters and tape and rope that was in the stockroom and on his person. One of the young women managed to raise the alarm. They were distressed, terrified, and Plumb was arrested. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of false imprisonment, and he was given a 32-month sentence for which he served 16 months in jail.
So we've got 2 incidents here, one which he was given a suspended sentence for, one which he was given a sentence for which he served, for 2 separate occasions where he attempted to kidnap women, essentially, one on the Stansted Express on 2 occasions and one of them in this Woolworths store that he was working at as a security guard. Let's forward wind all the way to December 2021. And we now know that Gavin Plumb was starting to fantasise about Holly Willoughby to the extent that he had loads of images of her.
He had 10,300 images of Holly Willoughby on his phone, and that was among millions of images of women across all his devices.
Millions of images.
Yeah, we were told this by one of the detectives who worked on the case. At this time, Plumb was at about 30 stone. Well, he's had weight loss surgery, but he talked about how his weight had fluctuated and he was spending 99% of his time online at home. And obviously, during the day, he has television for company. And it was there where he developed this, quote, sexual obsession for Holly Willoughby. But it was when you start looking around the case, who he was talking to and what he was, dare I say, assembling, that's where it starts to become a bit more striking.
Yes, it's not him in isolation at home just looking at lots of images of Holly Willoughby. He starts having fantasies about what he might do to her.
So we were told in court that Plumb had a relationship, a brief relationship with a woman in 2014. And during that time, he became interested in bondage, domination, and sadomasochism, which is commonly known as BDSM. And so he claimed that the person who he was in a relationship with, who he didn't name in court, had got him interested in it, and she was more into it than he was. But he started assembling, quote, a restraint kit. So he had bought handcuffs, ankle restraints, a ball gag, blindfold. And in that restraint kit was 400 metal cable ties. Now, he said that was to be used between consenting adults. That's what we were told. He also started meeting and speaking to people on encrypted chat groups. It could be WhatsApp groups, could be Kik groups, Wicker.
What's Kik?
It's a messaging platform, end-to-end encrypted. Mm-hmm. And he was joining groups and speaking to, quote, like-minded men. And when I say like-minded men, I'm talking about misogynists and men who have disregard for women and girls.
And not just saying horrible things about them or what they do to them, but actually discussing plans.
Yeah, but they also were talking about, they were talking about women in the public eye, women who they didn't know, commenting on women and girls. And so it's like the stepping stone, some might say. And it was around 2021 when he met this man called Mark, who we were told lived in Ireland. And it was almost as if they were goading each other. And over a period of months, they start talking about this, quote, plan, this plot. And the messages are extremely graphic. Many were obscene, and I can't even say many of them now for fear of breaching obscenity laws. But it spoke to the level of rampant misogyny that was just taking place quite freely between two men who'd never met, but were just talking about women in the most degrading way possible.
You said that there were some of the messages in there which you couldn't put in the Times newspaper because of obscenity laws and the rest. What was it like when some of them were read out in court? I mean, what did everyone in the court do when some of these were either said or referenced?
So I was sat opposite the jury. My immediate memory is looking across the courtroom and seeing a particular juror, and there was a very obscene remark that was made in one message. I looked over and saw the look on their face as they read this particular passage, and it's hard to kind of convey the shock and the disgust. If you were aware of it, you too would feel, you'd wince.
In the language that was used or in the fantasy it was describing?
Both.
What was in the messages that we can talk about and report?
It was mostly around the idea of this fantasy. I remember one message he said, "I'm going to be living out my ultimate fantasy. I'm now at the point where this fantasy isn't enough anymore. I want the real thing." In other messages, when he's talking about his plan with Mark, he describes how he's going to carry out this offence, carry out the kidnap. And he says, chloroform the both of them, both being Holly Willoughby and her husband. And that way they can both be easily restrained. We're then going to force her to make a video saying she came with us under her own free will. And she's fully consenting to everything we do to her. So that covers us.
And this kind of crackers, disgusting chat continues, and as you said, into more sort of disgusting language and the rest. It's not just these two that are talking, we now know. It's not just Gavin and this Mark fella online. There's then a third person, David.
Correct. David Nelson spoke to Plumb in a public group on Kik called Abduct Lovers. And it's where men discuss kidnap, rape, and they track down accomplices to, quote, carry out murders. Plumb's profile picture was Holly Willoughby, and he had described her as, quote, the one that I want. And it's something that Plumb says which piques David Nelson's interest or his concern. Plumb says that he has a load of information on Holly Willoughby. So Nelson direct messages Plumb, and here they start talking for about a day and a half, in which Plumb reveals more and more about his plan and how he's going to, carry out this home invasion. He sends videos of his restraint kit. He talks about the chloroform, the 2 bottles that he'd bought online from a homeopathy pharmacy in Kent.
Stuff that shows that it looks like he's not messing around.
Exactly. And it was this which caused David Nelson to feel that there was an immediate threat to Holly Willoughby.
And David Nelson isn't who Gavin Plumb thought he was.
No, David Nelson was an undercover police officer.
From the US.
He was based in Owatonna, Minnesota.
And what on earth is he doing in these groups about abducting people?
So on the 4th day of the trial, he gave evidence and he explained that part of his work is to infiltrate these online groups to see if there are any threats to individuals' lives.
So he just lurks in these groups and tries to triage who is actually going to do something bad and who isn't.
Correct.
So what did he do with this information then?
So while Gavin Plumb was revealing more and more about his plan, David Nelson was carrying out open source research, and he discovered that Holly Willoughby was in fact a very well-known public figure in Britain. Obviously, Gavin Plumb had revealed he had a lot of information on her. He claimed he knew what time she left her house, that she didn't have CCTV. He claimed that he'd been tracking her movements. Couple that with his plans to carry out these kidnap, rape and murder. David Nelson had no choice, he said, but to flag his concerns to his team, who then contacted the FBI. The FBI contacted the Metropolitan Police, who then reached out to Essex Police. So within 1 hour of the final exchange between David Nelson and Gavin Plumb, Essex police officers had stormed Plumb's flat and arrested him.
Police! Stay where you are! Do not touch anything! Who else is home? What's going on? What the hell is going on?
And body-worn footage captures the moment Plumb appears in his bedroom. He's half naked and he's alarmed. He doesn't understand what's going on. And he says, then what's going on? What are you talking about?
You do not have to say anything.
What is going on? What are you talking about?
Mention one question, something which relates to line for anything you do, so maybe give me
Can you tell me what you're talking about? You're getting new, babe. All right.
And when the female police officer says the allegation is conspiracy to kidnap Holly Willoughby.
Yeah, so at the moment you're under arrest for conspiracy to kidnap. Who? Holly Willoughby.
I don't think those ones are warm.
That's the allegation.
His demeanour softened and he went, okay. And he said, look, I'm not going to lie. She's a fantasy of mine. She's a fantasy of a lot of blokes.
Okay then. That is the allegation. Yep.
I'm not going to lie, she's a fantasy of mine. I mean, she's a fantasy of a lot of guys, isn't she? Right.
When he finally got to court, what was his defence?
He dismissed it as, quote, just online chat. His lawyers argued that Plumb wasn't serious about committing these offences, and they were no more than dark fantasies that had just come to light and had been taken out of context.
You said that there was a point where one of the jurors looked especially shocked at a message that was read out. I mean, when that and other stuff was being read out, what did he look like, Gavin Plumb? Could you get a look of him? How was he responding to all of this?
I was sat by the door, but facing the entire courtroom. So to my left was the dock, to my right was the judge's bench. In front of me at the other end of the courtroom was where the jury was sat. And in the middle was where the legal teams, like his barristers and the prosecution team, were sitting. So we had quite a good view of the proceedings. But Plumb sat forward in his seat for most of the hearing. So you could only really see the top of his head or the side of his face.
And when he was giving evidence, how did he respond to all of this?
When his barrister was questioning him, you got the sense that he was almost talking to a friend because of his tone. He was, he spoke quite quickly, and there was several times in the proceedings where his barrister and the judge had to say, can you just slow it down, just so we can take a note and so the jury can hear what you're saying. He gave an idea of his life and some of the issues that he's had, and he acknowledged his previous offending. But when he was cross-examined by Alison Morgan, KC, who was the lead prosecutor, something shifted in court. Her opening gambit was, what did it feel like when you restrained that 16-year-old girl? The mood shifted. You felt people just sit up a little bit more. And the back and forth was fast. And he didn't not answer a question. And Ms. Morgan was just coming back with more questions. You got a sense that she wanted to make him reveal a little bit more than what he'd given previously to his own barrister.
Yeah.
How can you dismiss this as online chat? You've carried out crimes against women and girls in the past.
And the jury clearly didn't buy it.
Guilty on all three charges. Gavin Plumb guilty of soliciting Holly Willoughby's murder, encouraging others to kidnap her and encouraging others to rape her.
A security guard who planned to kidnap, rape and murder Holly Willoughby has been found guilty.
The jury took 12 hours and 19 minutes to unanimously convict him of soliciting murder and encouraging or assisting the commission of rape and kidnap.
How did Holly Willoughby react to all this?
So Holly Willoughby wasn't present in court, and we were told from the outset that she wouldn't be giving evidence during the trial. But she released a statement about an hour after the unanimous verdicts were delivered in court, which is going to be read out by one of the podcast producers now.
As women, we should not be made to feel unsafe going about our daily lives and in our own homes. I will forever be grateful to the undercover police officer who understood the imminent threat, and to the Metropolitan and Essex police forces for their swift response. Thank you to the Crown Prosecution Service, the Right Honourable Mr Justice Murray, Alison Morgan KC, the members of the jury, and all involved in this case for ensuring that justice was done and that the defendant will not be able to harm any more women. I would also like to commend the bravery of his previous victims for speaking up at the time. Without their bravery, this conviction may not have been possible.
Of course, there was lots of interest in this case because Holly Willoughby was at the centre of it, and it did have some particularly grim details, which we've heard a bit about. But also, I guess it struck a chord because it really does get to an enormous, much wider problem, as Holly Willoughby alluded to in her statement, in our culture.
Yeah, and that's the safety of women and girls across the country, whether they're in their home, whether they're going about their business, walking down the street, using their phones, catching a bus, going to work, coming home from dinner, going to the gym, driving their car. Mm-hmm. And actually, we know this. We know that violence against women and girls, quite rightly, is on top of the news agenda. It sometimes wavers, but there's more of a recognition of it. There's more of an impetus for men to check their behaviour and to call out instances where you might be privy to sexual harassment or catcalling or just bad behaviour.
Because who knows, I guess, how things can spiral and develop with certain characters. I mean, it certainly seemed to with this guy, Gavin Plumb. This is quite an unusual case, though, isn't it? Because of the online element and using these quite grim chat rooms. Although it seems like there were other people in there, so who knows? I'm
going to say yes and no to that, because I interviewed one of the detectives on the case, and he said this type of case is rare. Even when we were told in court that David Nelson, he monitors these groups, and maybe once a year he might have a case like this where he has to flag it to the FBI and they have to mobilise and move very quickly because someone's...
Once a year, so the rest of it is just oddballs, genuinely just fantasising, I guess.
Potentially, but also that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't lead to criminal action.
Yes.
But in this type of case where there was an immediate threat to somebody's life, that was quite unusual. But it's not unusual in terms of the level of misogyny that's been meted out in these types of groups.
It's something the Detective Chief Inspector Greg Woode of Essex Police, who led the investigation, touched on.
This case has brought misogyny and violence against women and girls to the fore. It has demonstrated that we all have much to do to stamp it out of society. It cannot be right that men like Gavin Plumb are able to join online forums where they freely vent their hatred towards women and girls and plot to cause them harm.
There's so much out there that unless you're engaged in that world or you're aware of it, it can be quite hard to quantify it. But then I suppose the thing that really struck me, this is quite innocuous in some respects, was how you have an open profile and you have a public profile, for example, and you have people who will want to follow you and they're asking you, where did you buy that from? Or what product is this from? Or when does this TV show start? Or when are you back doing X? People feel like they can follow you and they feel like you're part of their life because you're in their homes every morning or every Sunday evening for an hour and a half. And if you're posting pictures, innocuous pictures, it could be of what you're wearing or where you are. The thing that really struck me was how those pictures can be used and taken out of their context and reposted in dark corners of the internet. And you can be blissfully unaware that you're being dehumanised and degraded. And for some people, it's just dismissed as online chat.
But that's the point. You want to get to it when it's chat online and hasn't spiraled off into something else and worse.
But actually, there's something pernicious at play. You ask yourself, in this particular case, it was an officer who was thousands of miles away in Minnesota, in the US, that essentially foiled this plot. And even Holly Willoughby said in her statement that she'll always be forever grateful to David Nelson for stopping this.
What was it like for you sitting through all of this? I mean, quite a grim case, even in, I guess, a job which is full of quite grim cases.
It's a really interesting question, and one that's probably quite difficult to answer now, if that makes sense, because I find that when you cover a murder case or when you cover a serious sexual assault case or rape case, you're taking so much information, you're trying to process as much. And I think it's only when you finish covering a case, when you've seen it through from start to finish, that you can kind of understand it as a whole. And I think for me, the takeaway was just how little we know culturally about these online groups, these kind of misogynistic forums where women and girls are discussed, demeaned, dehumanised. I just couldn't get over how everyday images that someone has put out that don't really reveal too much, because we know Holly Willoughby is a very private person, in terms of away from work. You don't really know too much about her. But when someone does decide to share things that they're comfortable with, how those can be used and weaponised and distributed and misused was quite alarming to me.
And it's an insight into, as you say, a world which we don't know that much about. Do we really know the scale of the problem? I mean, we know there's a problem with toxic masculinity in the real world, let alone in the online world. But in this particular gruesome corner, do we know how big it is?
I have been trying to find that out. I think it's hard to quantify it because, for example, Gavin Plumb was a member of 2 groups. Unless you know how many members are in the group, how long it's been going, how many splinter groups have been created from members. But that's just 2 groups on one platform. You're also thinking about the internet. You're thinking about forums, closed spaces, where these types of discussions take place every minute of every hour of every day. And I understand in some respects the problem that policing is facing. Because how do you monitor this? Do you rely on people to call it out? Do you rely on the David Nelsons of the world who just happen to stumble into these groups and they see a post that raises a flag and they go down that rabbit hole? But there are charities and women's groups and some men's groups as well who are doing some really great work to call it out, to make men and young boys accountable for their behaviour, and to say it's not okay to do this, and have a word with yourself, have a word with your friends. And you ask yourself, where does it start? How early should we be talking about this? Gavin Plumb had his first criminal conviction at the age of 20. But what led him down that path? What led him down that path where he thought he had the right to try and abduct two women who were going to work or coming from work? It's difficult to answer, isn't it?
That was David Woode, crime correspondent at The Times. This is a fascinating and, of course, a bleak story. But if you found it interesting, there might be someone else you know who also might be interested in listening to this episode. If they haven't stumbled across our podcast before, why not send us a link so they can listen as well? You can find more of David's work at thetimes.com, and we've actually put links to David's reporting on the Plumb trial in the description notes of this episode. There is so much more detail that we couldn't get to. If you've a Time subscription, you can read away. The producers today were Will Rowe, Lottie Hayton and Chris Wade. The executive producer was Edward Drummond. Sound design was by Tom Birchall and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.